So where does lasting change come from? How Tom Holland's Dominion challenges mission efforts influenced by secularism. By Jim Harries. My reading of Tom Holland's book Dominion has been massively encouraging and profoundly disturbing. We live in an age in which many presuppositions made by prominent Christian and non-Christian scholars alike, such as of the absolute value of concern for victims, are wrongly considered to be rooted in presumed universal secular thinking. Now I suggest that Holland's historical discoveries that point to this error implicitly necessitate a world currently unfamiliar, in which theology leads the way and in which Christ rules. That implies a need to retune over 100 years of progress, so-called. I believe Holland's historical analyses are correct. I do not mean in every detail. I'm not in a position to confirm that. I put Holland in the same category as Girard and Mangalwadi. Both these authors, like Holland, conclude that Christianity and the Bible have been pivotal in making the West to be what it is today. Implications of Holland's book, read in reverse for Africa, stare menacingly at an astute viewer. Holland graphically articulates how, by today's Western standard, massive levels of cruelty were intrinsic to pre-Christian civilizations. He brings his argument right up to date through personal encounter with Islamic State, demonstrating that people who reject the gospel can be as cruel now as were pre-Christian people then. The steps that Holland shows European people as having followed to reach today's ethics of concern for victims are spread over centuries. His historical rendition of events implicitly suggests that deep changes leading to today's high valuation of victims held by Europeans might have to occur gradually in non-Western peoples. Holland's account raises a mammoth question. Were people such as those in Africa, who until very recently were not influenced by Christianity or dualism or by Europeans, as cruel as were peoples of antiquity? Related to that question, what today stands between them and a recurrence of such kinds of cruelty? A survey of the evidence, see shortly, that seeks to understand pre-colonial Africa tells us that perhaps they were so. Christian mission has told them of another way, that way of love. Many Africans are now determined followers of that way. We, rightly I believe, therefore can assume that they are on a course toward knowing God's grace and becoming profoundly concerned for victims. A possible hiccup, however, very, very often the gospel comes to Africa with massive subsidy. This raises a question: how many people follow the gospel because it has money? How many follow it so far as it raises their living standard? Or, in reverse to that, how many reject it because it is Western? African people might be saying the things they're paid to say. They might be imitating lifestyles of European peoples. Yet their populace, not having shared in the European history, raises a question of whether they have deeply appropriated the values that underlie those European ways of life. This in turn leads to the question, without European financial and other control and subsidy, whether in a crisis, whether denied outside charity over an extended period, how will today's African people live? Implicit to Holland's account is a suggestion that they remain deeply rooted in old and more cruel ways of life. Then the veneer of modern civilization ethics that they wear may be thin, perhaps very thin indeed. An important question is, how were African people living in the pre-colonial, pre-missionary era? Now that question has much occupied scholars. However, of late, I suggest, the question has become taboo. A dominant West with a romantic orientation wants to believe that the savage is noble. Anti-racism requires the same belief. Any suggestion that pre-colonial African people might have been as cruel as were those depicted by Holland in antiquity is in today's scholarly dominated world largely unacceptable. Holland forces us to come back to this issue and encourages us to explore it in more detail. Following Holland's reasoning, the gospel has taken 2,000 years to get the West the way it is now. Much of Africa has had little over 100 years of exposure to the gospel. I suggest that the nature of their exposure has been very different to that once experienced by European peoples. It has been, and it continues to be, foreign dominated. Official feedback available to the global scholarly world I'm here addressing also comes through translation into English. Here, translation always occurs in a context such that much intended meaning that may have been put into African languages, including African English, is lost when that is all heard in Western English. And an additional enormous difficulty, African communication to the West surely reflects its dependency on the West. What Africa communicates is intended to please donors. To obscure differences with the West, that would imply its being primitive or inherently cruel and so unworthy of donor largesse. Anti-racism, a vast, multinational, heavily promoted, massively subsidized secular initiative currently receiving enormous attention globally, implicitly backs the view that the lived gospel over history has brought no significant help to European peoples. It seems clear to me that Holland's thesis stands in opposition, therefore, to anti-racism. The very fact that concerns related to racism, particularly in its classic expression of white versus black, is such a prominent, hot and volatile ongoing issue, points to the truth of Holland's thesis. Anti-racism in its commonplace secular form is ultimately, I suggest, anti-Christian. It aggressively seeks to ignore the impact of the gospel on people over centuries. I do not have space here to do justice to the breadth of the discussion about colonial Africa. Yet, given especially the way that it has come to be intentionally occluded, plus ways in which truths about Africa continue to be concealed in the interests of anti-racism, also there, I suggest that indeed life in Africa before the advent of the gospel was, in contemporary Western terms, incredibly cruel. This is not to deny that cruelties weren't also perpetuated under colonial rule. But the point is that according to Holland, the Christianity-shaped West found a way to deal with cruelty in its own cultures and civilizations, which has made it attractive to many outside of the West. Recalled by African people of cruelty in their own history and ongoing expressions of cruelty help to explain actually the massive popularity of the gospel in Africa today. I illustrate this cruelty by referring to two authors who explore pre-colonial Africa. Simonti's account of southern Sudan tells of numerous killings that would in contemporary Western terms be considered despicable. Mellon's account similarly. On Mellon's estimate, infant mortality in the African population he studied was before the advent of colonialism between 60 and 75%. I could even add thirdly, Ayan's account of contemporary life in Somalia. The truth that Holland implicitly suggests about Africa explains a vast amount. That is, a vast amount that is not pleasant. That which he uncovers has enormous implications for Christian mission. I believe that it tells us, with respect to Africa, that Christian mission is far from done and dusted. It's still needed. Following Holland, the mission of the Church as a compassionate community that would today in the West be considered morally upright remains a prerogative of the West to the rest, and not just everyone to everywhere. The evidence for this is widely found with respect to Africa, despite efforts to conceal it. We have stories of corrupt African bishops, the prosperity gospel, genocide in Rwanda in 1994, intra-black violence in Western cities, widespread drunkenness in much of Christian Africa, sexual immorality, prominent witchcraft, corruption, the whole gambit. So I suggest that the mission task which the West has in the interest of secularism to some extent pulled back from and concealed using donor funds is more urgent than ever. It is not a completed task. African pseudo-modern compassion for victims may not stretch very far, may stretch no longer than the number of dollars they're getting. How do we know that that's not the case? We don't know. Take away controlling hand, and killing of victims might mushroom in Africa, as Holland found was the case of Islamic State with respect to crucifixions, requiring Christians, i.e. secular forces with deep roots in Christianity, to rescue Muslims from each other. Now, if Holland is correct, Western Church's mission efforts to Africa need very urgent attention, revitalization, and massive overhaul. Yet, some may respond, but the gospel itself deserves a lot of the negative reporting that it's recently enjoyed. For Holland, criticisms of Christianity that remain largely extant in the West today are based on lies. For example, that Christians had a fanatical hatred of reason. Just not true. Secularists have their pragmatic reasons for perpetuating lies about Christianity. Such lies make no sense in indigenous Africa. Westerners need to see through such deceptions. From personal experience, I suggest that taking the gospel to traditional Africa exposes those lies. If only Western people were to take a proper look. In Africa, for example, the church is booming. The same applies everywhere outside of the West, it seems to me, where Islam's incredibly heavy hand, or that of dictatorial governments such as that of China, are not curtailing the gospel on threat of violence and of death. So I suggest that the Bible increasingly provides the structures to almost all the good that goes on in today's Africa. Especially if you remember that Western secularism is itself based on the Bible. Although it sometimes seems everywhere massive propaganda efforts endeavour to veil that truth. Let us look at so-called secular education by way of case study. I suggest it can be helpful to think of African schools as what? Religious temples. The secular nature of Western education that they're imitating frequently does not go beyond rote learning. Observation tells me, time and time again, that the lifeblood of successful education in Africa is what? It's the gospel. Secularism that was established in the West for pragmatic reasons is not founded on truth. In its favour, it enables other, even radically counter-Christian ways of life, such as those pursued by Muslims, to some extent benefit from Christianity without overt adoption of Christianity. Now, the wanton concealing of the work of churches in Africa by untold secular bodies, including massive global entities like the UN, World Health Organization, Sustainable Development Project, and so on, is gross and just too often unwarranted and unfortunately dangerous. If not, sometimes even plain cruel and evil. Why conceal God's good? These observations have massive implications for Christian mission in Africa and beyond by the West today and tomorrow. The West has been hoodwinked into believing secularism. This applies even inside the church. The Western Church's mission efforts have, I suggest, been in recent decades much guided by secularism. This has contributed to mission being dominated by development agendas, donor relationships, much withdrawal of on-the-ground Western personnel. Now, part of the impact of secularism on Western mission efforts has been that often believers in the West spread the gospel as a means to bringing secular benefits. Thus, the emphasis, even by mission bodies these days, on biomedical health services, Western education, redistribution of wealth and all that, great things, but yet, it seems secular powers have succeeded in hoodwinking many Christians into overlooking the kinds of changes that Holland himself highlights. Unfortunately, perhaps, they're supposing that savages who do not have Christ are noble has been misguided. Yet caution is needed. Of course, Westerners are not superior. They are not noble either. We must continue to learn from the Bible. Superiority does not belong to a people, be they Westerners or Africans, Jews or Greeks. Superiority belongs to Christ, to God. Mission is not making them more like us. It is not forcing them to be better like us. It is sharing what we've acquired from the gospel. It is sharing Jesus. Contemporary approaches to mission, rooted in superior Western access to funds and cultural advantage, I suggest, fall short. Effective mission should not be rooted in either linguistic, cultural, or financial superiority. Key pivotal mission initiatives by the Western Church should not be implemented by funding others. Should be Westerners themselves, down to grassroots, having their feet on the ground. Westerners themselves must use indigenous majority word languages. Some of them should cease from buying, in inverted commas, the people they're reaching. This way of doing mission is known as vulnerable mission, and that's what I'm advocating as the way forward tomorrow, given the need that I'm pointing to and articulating that mission be continued today and tomorrow. Thank you very much.